Hello, and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohegan. Other Minds, founded in 1992 in San Francisco by Charles Amerkanian and Jim Newman, is devoted to championing the most original voices in new and experimental music. On Season 4 of the podcast, we're talking with a range of composers, performers, and authors across the field of new music, including the featured composers from the 29th Other Minds Festival, which will take place October 16th to 19th, 2025 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. Today we have a special episode for our listeners. Other Minds' own Devin King joins us to read an excerpt from our first ever OM book, Peter Garland's Ingram Marshall, A Personal and Musical Appreciation. Born in 1952 in Portland, Maine, Peter Garland was one of the original students at CalArts in 1970, where his principal teachers were Harold Budd and James Tenney. From 1971 to 1991, he edited and published Soundings Magazine and Press, where he printed the work of 4 generations of mostly American composers. As an editor and essayist, he played a pivotal role in the rediscovery and reevaluation of such composers as Conlon Nancarrow, Silvestre Revueltas, Lou Harrison, Paul Bowles, Dane Rudhyar, Harry Partch, and James Tenney. Devin, tell us a bit about Garland's relationship with Ingram Marshall and his perspective on Marshall's music.
Peter and Ingram met in about 1970 at CalArts, but I think we should let him tell the story. I'm going to be reading from the first part of the book. What's really wonderful about the book is that you don't really have to go into it knowing anything about Ingram or Peter, except, appreciating their work to some degree. And Peter kind of lays out the entire story for you. He tells you the story of their early meeting at CalArts, takes you through those sort of heady days there, and then walks you through Ingram's catalog. So I'm going to read excerpts of that. I'm going to read a little bit of the beginning where he kind of gives biographical information about Ingram. And then I'm going to read a few sections detailing Ingram's music. Specifically, I wanted to bring in the description of Dark Waters, which is the piece he composed for Libby Van Cleve, and that we're going to be producing at the Other Minds Festival this year.
Thanks, Devin. Peter Garland's Ingram Marshall, A Personal and Musical Appreciation will be available at Other Minds Festival 29, October 16th to 19th, 2025 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco, and online at the Other Minds web store. Here's a first look at what's in store. Take it away, Devin.
Chapter 1, Personal Memories and Parallel Lives. On the evening of May 31st, 2022, I was about to take my dog outside for the night when I casually turned on the radio to hear the 9 p.m. National Public Radio news headlines, something I normally don't do. I was startled when, for the second or third item of news, the announcer stated that American composer Ingram Marshall died today, and proceeded to say a few words of appreciation. I was both saddened and oddly gratified to hear this in this manner. I'm a firm believer in the surrealist laws of coincidence, so was, and still am, convinced that I was meant to turn on the radio, that this message was strangely meant for me, and others, of course. I was saddened to hear of his passing, but not completely surprised. I'd heard for some time that he had been in failing health, but did not suspect his death was so imminent. Ingram had turned 80 earlier in the month, and I had sent him a card congratulating him on this landmark, and saying what a pleasure it had been to be his friend, an ardent admirer of his music for the past half-century. I was gratified because I was frankly surprised that my friend's passing had made the national news, on live radio no less. I knew many people respected and even loved his music, as I do, But I said to myself, gee, I didn't realize Ingram was so famous. It is especially unusual for a classical or new music composer's death to be mentioned in the national media. Only a small handful of such composers, who have achieved a kind of brand name status, can expect something like that. And I'd never thought of Ingram as anything close to a household name, though some remarkably obscure popular musicians often get such mention, proving only the point that once one achieves one's 15 minutes of fame in pop culture, one is famous forever. Further eulogies and commentaries on his passing showed indeed how much his music was loved, although there were some notable critical absences, and the official New York Times obituary read like it had been cribbed from somewhere like Wikipedia. There was a very thoughtful and well-written appreciation by Ingram's friend and student Timo Andres that did appear in the Times, it should be noted. Ingram and I first met in the fall of 1970 at the newly founded California Institute of the Arts, CalArts, though we often like to refer to it as the CIA, a name the school obviously discouraged. I was an 18-year-old undergraduate and Ingram was a 28-year-old graduate student. As composers, I consider ourselves to be part of the same generation, which for me means people born from 1942 to 1954, with some overlap on either edge. From 1956 on, there was a distinct generational change, while many of the composers born in the 1930s were my teachers. So, Ingram was one of the older composers of our generation, and I was one of the youngest. Even though Ingram and I had similar, parallel lives and artistic development in the 1970s, that 10-year gap made for significant differences in our personalities and coming-of-age experiences. It also meant that in those early years, even though we were good musical friends from the start, we weren't intimate personal friends. A 10-year age difference means less and less as one grows older, but at age 28, Ingram was already a mature adult, so to speak, while at age 18, I was still a proverbial snot-nosed kid. I'd also come of age in the mid and late 1960s, the hippie era, and I was far more immersed in the ethos of those years. Ingram turned 15 in 1957. I turned 15 in 1967. Very different times. It also meant that I was a bit wilder than my older friends in terms of drug use and sometimes drinking, though that rarely caused any friction in the generally hedonistic tone of those years. Being 18 years old at the new CalArts also meant that I had dropped out of the straight classical music world and education system much earlier than Ingram, who had more or less followed that standard curriculum. So I've never had quite the same respect for or comfort in the classical music world and tradition. I say all this just to explain that for all our friendship and parallel careers, there were differences which have influenced my understanding and appreciation of his music. That said, over the half-century I've known him and I've watched and listened to Ingram's development with constant and ever-increasing admiration. I consider him one of the finest and most original composers of our generation. His is some of the most imaginative, intelligently constructed, and deeply moving music of our times, and that fact is reflected in people's responses to his work. The fact that his career was not as successful in certain senses as some others does not diminish that fact at all. I will make a quick list of some of the parallels our lives and musical development shared in the 1960s and 70s. First of all, before CalArts, both of us had been on the East Coast. Ingram was born in Mount Vernon, New York, and grew up in Mount Kisco. Both of us had been at Columbia, me as a freshman in 1969, and Ingram as a grad student a few years earlier. Ingram had gone to Columbia after graduating from Lake Forest College to pursue a master's degree in musicology with a focus on the Baroque era, but had been attracted to and seduced by the possibilities of electronic music, Columbia having one of the most renowned studios then. Electronic music allowed him to compose directly with sound without the intervention of scores or performers, which seemed like a more painterly approach to musical creation. Both of us had studied with Vladimir Ussachevsky, Ingram more directly as a composition student, me taking his History of Electronic Music seminar that fall. We never crossed paths at Columbia, so I believe by that point Ingram was working with Morton Subotnick at NYU, and it may have been Mort who alerted him to CalArts and encouraged him to go there, where Mort became Associate Dean of the Music Department and head of the Electronic Music program. So, both of us abandoned the East Coast and found ourselves in Burbank, California in the fall of 1970. By that point, both of us had been exposed to the music of John Cage and the incipient revolution occurring with the work of composers such as Lamont Young, Terry Riley, and Steve Reich. We were perhaps the first generation, or people Ingram's age were, to fully embrace a world music awareness that would deeply influence us. Both of us joined the Javanese Gamelan at CalArts in the fall of 1970, though I dropped out after 6 months due to scheduling conflicts and never rejoined. Nor was I part of that summer of 1971 trip to Bali that so influenced Ingram. As I noted, we both moved to Los Angeles, not San Francisco. I think that was significant. Early parallel lives and development, indeed. Chapter 2. Go West, Young Man. The CalArts Years. I take space to be the central fact to man born in America. America completes her West only on the coast of Asia. That's Charles Olson from Call Me Ishmael. I think that the move to California in 1970 was transformational for Ingram, not only as a musician, but as a person. This is partly borne out by the fact that we have no work from before 1970, and I know almost nothing about those years other than the basic, obvious biographical facts. It was as if that past was erased once his new life began out west. The first thing one encounters is the sense of space the West presents. It is vast, open, and startling compared to the more closed-in domestic landscapes of the East, or the relative monotony of the Midwest and the Great Plains. I do not deny a vastness and beauty there too, but for many Midwesterners, especially artistic types, it was a place one had to leave, going in either direction towards the coasts. Also, on the West Coast, the sense of history, or rather the burden of it, was different than on the East Coast, more open-ended towards the future and possibility than looking back to the past and tradition. And even though the San Francisco Bay Area became his eventual home base and was ideally convivial for his music and personality, I think it was significant and important that Ingram first landed in Los Angeles, and at CalArts in particular. Back in 1970, at least, when folks like me, and probably Ingram too, first arrived in LA, there was a real sense of culture shock. It had not only to do with the balmy climate, palm trees, the wide boulevards, and endless sprawl crisscrossed by freeways. It was also the people and many of our fellow students who seemed like they were almost from a different planet, postmodern, free of the burdens of European tradition. They were more open, spontaneous, more ready to go, and less self-conscious than their East Coast counterparts. It was like being a blank canvas. One could be anything, anyone. You did not feel weighed down by your family or social past like back east. There was also a pleasant naivete that was part of this freshness, because there were not as many unspoken rules as to how to be or behave. On the East Coast, the art world tended to quickly devolve into the usual morass of celebrity and big money. In California, there were celebrities and big money in Hollywood and Beverly Hills, to be sure, but everywhere else, things were more wide open imaginatively, and the air easier to breathe, even in LA, than in the dank underworld of Lower Manhattan or in the more posh uptown scene. And besides, there was one consolation for LA smog. It made for pretty sunsets. Los Angeles had no real center, apart perhaps from the downtown by the LA Art Museum. Instead, it was spread out. There were small, separated centers, Santa Monica, Venice perhaps, the Laurel and Topanga Canyons, Pasadena, Hollywood, and Sunset Boulevards, UCLA. But one had to drive to get anywhere. Los Angeles has never been a walking town, unlike San Francisco and Berkeley. And the architecture was very different, an odd mix of southwestern, avant-garde, ranch house, suburban tract home, strip malls, which gave off little sense of history or tradition. Even despite the 1906 earthquake and fire that razed so much of the city, San Francisco still gives off an older, more European feel. Berkeley had the comfortable, verdant, leafy feeling of a college town. Both were ideal walking cities, with neighborhood cafes and meeting spots, like San Francisco's famous North Beach, which had been a hub for the literary renaissance of the 1950s. LA had little or none of that, apart from a famous bookstore or restaurant here and there. I'm not sure to what extent Barney's Beanery or Beyond Baroque will go down in art history like the Cedar Bar in New York or the City Lights bookstore in San Francisco. CalArts' arrival on the scene in LA in the fall of 1970 came at a moment when the scene that had developed in the late 1950s and 60s was in decline. Famously, it was the brainchild of Walt Disney, among others, so our patron saint was Mickey Mouse. The permanent campus was not ready by the announced opening date, so during the first years, CalArts was housed in Burbank at the former Villa Cabrini Academy Catholic Girls' School. It was a rather idyllic campus, actually, with multiple buildings, a swimming pool, which became notorious for its lax dress code, or rather no dress at all, and orange groves in the back, perfect for smoking pot. In other words, the student body was obviously a fun-loving bunch, aside from the serious art-making going on. Being in Burbank meant we were also closer to downtown LA than we were when we moved to the new campus in Valencia, now Santa Clarita, after the February 1971 earthquake, which damaged Villa Cabrini. Students and faculty almost universally agreed that the monolithic new campus was a monstrosity, which gave it its own quirky charm. And consensus was that if the institute ever went belly up, the building could be sold off and converted into a mental institution. Another important fact, which also thickened the plot in some positive ways, was that the new CalArts was in the middle of nowhere, just off Interstate 5, between the canyon and ranching county of Saugus and Newhall, and the orange groves of Piru, Fillmore, and Ventura to the west. The CalArts Music School, like the rest of the institute, was riven by contradiction and conflict. While the instrumental department was rather conservative, as was our dean, the composer Mel Powell, whom I always liked, the composition and electronic music departments were a hotbed of the avant-garde. The 2 years that Ingram spent at CalArts from the fall of 1970 to the spring-summer of 1972 were crucial to his development as a composer. One of Ingram's early collaborations on the East Coast was with oboist Libby Van Cleve. There are issues right off the bat with the dates of the two pieces Ingram wrote for her. In the New Albion CD liner notes, the dates for Dark Waters and Holy Ghosts are given as 1995 and 1999. On his website, they are listed as 1993 and 1995. Someone needs to revise his list of works and get this confusion settled once and for all. One might approach an album that features two works for an oboe soloist with a certain trepidation, thinking of all those same sounding Baroque concertos. But Ingram creates a great deal of variety and musical interest. The two pieces are very different in character and in fact feature two different instruments, neither of which is a modern oboe. The first one, Dark Waters is for English horn. The second is for oboe d'amore, which is in fact a Baroque instrument. The idea of these pieces is not so different in concept from, say, the Fragility Cycles, a solo instrument playing against a background of electronically generated sounds. But Libby's playing and Ingram's writing for her is far more sophisticated than Ingram improvising on his gamboo flute. Dark Waters is like an aria or serenade for English horn, playing with a simulated orchestra. Quite a few composers with no access to real orchestras did this, creating orchestral textures electronically. Daniel Lentz and Harold Budd are notable examples. The piece begins with low string sounds along with higher violins, apparently, according to Ingram's notes, quoting an actual fragment from Sibelius. I call this piece an aria rather than a concerto because the English horn doesn't play against or in contrast to the electronic orchestra, but is rather comfortably nested within it. The effect sounds Mahleresque at times, or, I guess, like Sibelius. Certainly, the somber lyricism echoes the latter. The lower register of the English horn occasionally sounds like a bassoon. Notable, as I've said, is how well crafted Ingram's melodic solo writing is, and it is of course equally well played. Ingram's handling of the electronics is ever more sophisticated too, including Libby's instrument being treated with tape delays and other processing so that at times she plays with and against herself. The electronic orchestration is very consistent and well done, and the piece has a sense of overall continuity and unity as if it were a real orchestra. A lovely, evocative work in the style of, or as homage to, the old Finnish master. Hypnotic Delays was another commission collaboration with Paul Hillier, this time for his ensemble Theater of Voices, consisting of just 4 singers, a soprano, countertenor, tenor, and baritone, Hillier himself. I suspect there may be a play of words on the idea of hypnotic delays. Ingram writes, "It was at Paul's suggestion that I explore the repertory of early New England composers, singing masters, in order to gain materials for my piece." Ingram was living in New England at this point, and the commission premiere was at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, so there was a logic to this suggestion. Also, Paul had recently recorded a CD of this material, Gustli Psalms, Anglo-American Psalmody, 1550 to 1800. 2 of the pieces Ingram chose to work with, Wyndham by Daniel Reed and Amanda by Justin Morgan, are on that CD. He only uses the first quatrain of each of those, and I assume from a third hymn, Northfield by Jeremiah Ingalls. The 4th piece is a setting of the 23rd Psalm from the Bay Psalm Book, 9th edition, 1698, which is the first known example of printed music in the colonies. He titles this 4th piece Low Dutch, but gives no explanation for doing so, since the text is in English. Perhaps this English text was a translation of an original Low Dutch version? What most characterizes these settings is their clarity and simplicity. This is due first of all to those same qualities in the originals. Ingram writes, "I do not consider my reworkings of these tunes to be improvements, but simply elaborations that seek to pay homage to the straightforward, honest, and often poignant expressive music of this era."
Peter Garland's Ingram Marshall, A Personal and Musical Appreciation, will be available in book form at Other Minds Festival 29, October 16th to 19th, 2025, at the Brava Theater in San Francisco, and online at the Other Minds web store. You can also hear Garland's Songs of Exile and Wine on Night 1 of the Other Minds Festival, Thursday, October 16th, performed by soprano Maria Texas and pianist Jeffrey Burleson. Thanks to Devin King for reading for us today, and thanks everyone for listening. This has been an episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. Our 29th festival is October 16th to 19th, 2025 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. Join us again next week.